The bell rang at Langley School at precisely 3:15, as it had for the last 47 years, though several staff would later insist it sounded different that afternoon. Longer, some said. Thinner. A few claimed it faltered, as though uncertain of its duty. These observations emerged politely, days later, and with the confidence of people who had already decided what the bell must have meant. Inspector Purbright arrived while the bell was still being discussed. He stood just inside the main entrance, removing his gloves with deliberate care, listening to a woman from the office explain that no one had heard anything unusual at all, except perhaps that everyone had. Her voice hovered between reassurance and offense, as though the inspector had personally accused the bell of misconduct. The corridor beyond smelled of chalk dust and floor polish. Children's drawings lined the walls in strict chronological obedience, each labeled in the same careful handwriting. Autumn trees, Roman shields, a worrying number of cats. Nothing in the arrangement suggested chaos. That, Purbright thought, was the trouble with schools. They specialized in order right up until they didn't. The head teacher, Mr. Dalloway, appeared from a doorway marked staff only, smiling in the manner of a man trained to welcome inspectors of all kinds while privately resenting the need. His handshake was firm and brief. Entirely shocking, he said, before Purbright had asked anything. Unthinkable, really. Purbright nodded, which encouraged continuation. We pride ourselves on atmosphere, Dalloway went on. Calm, purposeful, safe. Yes, said Purbright. So I see. They walked together down the corridor. Dalloway spoke continuously, not so much providing information as ensuring no silence settled long enough to become inquisitive. He mentioned exam results, the new heating system, a recent commendation from the council. All of it floated just ahead of relevance. The classroom was at the end of the science wing, a small, unremarkable room, its door already open, as though it had nothing to hide. Inside, desks were aligned with moral conviction. The board still bore the remains of a chemistry equation, incomplete but tidy. Someone had wiped around it carefully, preserving the symbols as if they might yet explain themselves. The body had been removed. This was explained immediately and with a certain pride and efficiency. We didn't want the children exposed, Dalloway said. Naturally, Purbright agreed. A constable stood by the window, staring at the playing fields beyond with unnecessary focus. He straightened when he noticed the inspector, then relaxed again, reassured by Purbright's expression, which suggested neither urgency nor disappointment. What time was the discovery? Purbright asked. Dalloway cleared his throat. Just after lunch. The bell had gone. Pupils were changing rooms. And the room was meant to be empty. Yes, entirely. Purbright moved slowly, hands behind his back. He observed the teacher's desk, the neatly stacked exercise books, the cup ring at its corner. He noted the chair placed slightly away, as though recently pushed back with restraint rather than force. Who uses this room, he asked. Several departments, Dalloway replied. Science, obviously. Occasionally history, if there's an overflow. And the victim? Dalloway hesitated. Just enough. A teacher. Well-liked. That wasn't my question, said Purbright mildly. The head teacher blinked, then smiled again, smaller this time. Of course. Miss Harland. Chemistry. Purbright acknowledged the name without comment. Names, he had learned, were often better left unexamined until they had settled. They stepped back into the corridor, where two women stood talking in low voices. They stopped when they noticed him, adopting expressions of immediate usefulness. Inspector, Dalloway said, gesturing. This is Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Calder, both senior staff. Senior enough, Mrs. Finch said, with a glance that suggested hierarchy was a matter of personal interpretation. Purbright greeted them politely. Mrs. Calder washed his shoes. We're all quite shaken, Mrs. Finch continued. Of course, but one must carry on. Of course, said Purbright again. She was last seen at lunch, Mrs. Calder added, as though contributing an ingredient. Eating very little. Purbright turned his attention to her. Is that unusual? Mrs. Calder frowned, considering loyalty versus accuracy. She was particular. About food. About things. A bell rang again somewhere deeper in the building. This one was shorter. More decisive. Purbright glanced toward the sound, then back at the two women, who had already decided what it signified. Routine, Mrs. Finch said quickly. End of clubs. Yes, said Purbright. Routine has a way of continuing. He thanked them and moved away, leaving behind a silence that immediately filled with revised versions of what had just been said. As he reached the exit, Purbright paused and looked back down the corridor. It looked precisely as it should. That, he suspected, would prove inconvenient. Outside, the playground was emptying. Children left in clusters, supervised and unobservant in equal measure. Parents waited by the gates, checking watches, phones, faces. None of them yet knew what had happened inside. They would, soon enough. Purbright put on his gloves. The bell, he reflected, had done nothing wrong. It was the timing that concerned him. The staff room lay at the center of the building like a held breath, neither classroom nor office, and therefore permitted a kind of behavior that belonged properly to neither. Inspector Purbright entered it without ceremony, pausing only to close the door gently behind him. The room was already occupied, though no one had been speaking. Mrs. Finch sat nearest the window, her hands folded around a mug she did not lift. Mrs. Calder stood by the notice board, reading a laminated reminder about fire procedures with conspicuous attention. Two other teachers occupied chairs at the far table, both looking down at papers they were not marking. Purbright waited until the silence had finished establishing itself. "Thank you for allowing me in," he said. "I won't take much time." "No trouble at all," Mrs. Finch replied. "We were just having tea." She gestured vaguely at the kettle, which was cold. Purbright took a seat offered without enthusiasm and accepted a cup that appeared in front of him as if by social obligation rather than hospitality. He did not drink. The room smelled faintly of instant coffee and disinfectant, a combination suggesting that comfort here was carefully regulated. "I understand Miss Harland often spent her breaks here," he said. "Yes," said Mrs. Calder, turning at last. Usually alone," added one of the teachers at the table, a thin man with a cautious voice. "That wasn't because she was unfriendly," Mrs. Finch said quickly. "She simply preferred quiet." "Everyone does," Purbright agreed. "Some more defensively than others." Mrs. Finch smiled at that, though her eyes remained watchful. She was precise, Mrs. Calder said, in her habits. If something was moved, she noticed. If a rule existed, she observed it. And if it didn't? Purbright asked. Mrs. Calder hesitated. She would suggest one. A faint sound came from the corridor outside, the distant shuffle of chairs being stacked. No one looked toward it. The staff room was a place where outside noises were treated as impolite intrusions. Did she argue? Purbright asked. No, said the thin man. She documented. There was a brief murmur of assent. Documentation, Mrs. Finch said, is not the same as accusation. No, said Purbright. It often feels worse. He glanced at the notice board. Among the official papers was a handwritten note reminding staff to label shared food. Someone had underlined the word shared twice. Was Miss Harland well liked? He asked. The room adjusted itself. She was respected, Mrs. Finch said carefully. She was reliable, Mrs. Calder added. She was correct, said the thin man. Purbright nodded, as though this formed a complete picture. He asked about the morning, about who had seen whom and when. Answers arrived promptly, politely, and with just enough variation to prevent harmony. Lunch had been uneventful. Lessons had proceeded. Bells had rung. No one heard anything, Mrs. Finch said. At least, nothing that sounded wrong. And yet, Purbright said, something did. The thin man shifted in his chair. It's a large building. Sounds travel oddly. Only when they choose to, Purbright replied. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Calder. You mentioned she was last seen at lunch. Yes, in here. Eating very little, Purbright prompted. Mrs. Calder sighed. A yogurt. Half of it. Did she say anything? No, did she ever? Mrs. Calder considered. Not unnecessarily. Purbright thanked them all and stood. The conversation had reached its natural conclusion, which was to say it had become uncomfortable without producing anything overtly useful. As he moved toward the door, Mrs. Finch spoke again. Inspector, she said, this is a decent school. I'm sure it is, Purbright replied. And whatever happened, she continued, it won't change that. Purbright paused, his hand on the handle. Events have a habit of rearranging things, he said, even when everyone is very tidy. Outside, the corridor seemed longer than before. The quiet had shifted, no longer neutral, but expectant. Purbright walked slowly, noting the way doors remained closed, the way voices dropped when he passed. Civility, he reflected, was not the absence of conflict. It was merely conflict taught to sit still. He had learned a great deal, though nothing he could yet prove. By the time Inspector Purbright returned to the science wing, the school had shed its daytime pretense. The corridors no longer echoed with movement, but held sound instead, as though every footstep had been carefully stored for later consideration. Cleaning staff worked methodically, their presence announced by the soft click of trolleys and the disciplined swish of mops. They nodded to Purbright with professional neutrality, accustomed to seeing strangers who asked questions without offering answers. He paused outside the classroom again. The door had been closed now, not locked, merely returned to its proper state. Someone had wiped the handle until it shone. Inside, the light was on, harsh and unflattering, revealing the room's devotion to order. Desks aligned, chairs tucked, bins emptied. Nothing suggested interruption. That absence felt deliberate. Purbright stepped in and stood still, allowing the room to settle around him. He did not look immediately at the teacher's desk. Instead, he studied the windows, the way the late afternoon light angled across the sill. Dust floated there, visible only when caught just so. During lessons, children would have sat with their backs to it, unaware. He moved at last toward the board. The incomplete equation remained. Someone had taken care not to erase it entirely, a courtesy extended only to things considered useful. He wondered who had made that decision and when. From the corridor came the sound of voices. He stepped back out as two students appeared at the far end, both old enough to look uncertain without supervision. They stopped when they saw him. "Sorry," one said quickly. "We're just getting our bags." Purbright smiled. "No apology required. What are your names?" They gave them, glancing at each other as if checking for accuracy. "You were here earlier," Purbright said. It was not a question. "Yes," the other replied. "Last lesson. In this room." "Yes." "What were you learning?" The first student hesitated. "Rates of reaction. And did anything unusual happen?" They exchanged looks again. This time the glance was shorter. "No," said the second student. "Nothing." Purbright nodded. Teachers appreciate nothing happening. They laughed politely, then remembered themselves and stopped. As they passed him, one added, "Miss Harland was a bit strict, but fair." Fairness, Purbright thought, was another word that invited interpretation. He returned to the classroom and took a seat at one of the desks, ignoring the faint protest of the chair. From this position, the teacher's desk was fully visible. He noted the alignment of the exercise books, the absence of personal effects. No photograph, no ornament. A workplace reduced to function. A sound came from the doorway. Mrs. Calder stood there, arms folded, as though she had been passing coincidentally. "I thought you might still be here," she said. "So did I," Purbright replied. She stepped inside, but did not cross the threshold fully. "I remembered something." "Yes." "She was here after school yesterday." "Miss Harland." "Alone?" Mrs. Calder nodded. "She said she had marking." "Did she often stay late?" "Only when something concerned her." "And was she concerned yesterday?" Mrs. Calder looked at the floor. "She asked me about timetable changes. Changes that hadn't happened yet." "Yes." "Why would that worry her?" Mrs. Calder smiled thinly. She disliked uncertainty. Purbright considered this. "Did anyone else stay late?" "A few," Mrs. Calder said. "Staff meeting preparation, parents' emails, and students." She shook her head. "Not officially." The word lingered. Purbright thanked her and watched as she retreated, leaving the door open behind her, a small act of rebellion or oversight. As dusk settled, the cleaners finished their circuit. The school grew quieter still, as though relieved. Purbright stood and took one last look around. The room had taught him very little, but it had done so honestly. He switched off the light and closed the door. In the corridor, the bell mechanism was visible behind a small panel. He did not touch it. Lessons, he reflected, were not confined to timetables. Some were observed only after hours, when no one expected to be examined. Memory announced itself at Langley the following morning with an efficiency that suggested rehearsal. Flowers appeared at the gate before 8, arranged neatly so as not to obstruct entry. The office produced a book of condolences with a seriousness normally reserved for inspection visits. By 9:30, the staff had agreed on which expressions of shock were appropriate and which were indulgent. Inspector Purbright arrived during this period of agreement. He did not linger at the gate. though he noticed the way people paused there, adjusting their faces before proceeding. Inside, the atmosphere had acquired a careful softness, as though raised voices might disturb something delicate but undefined. He was directed toward the small hall beside reception, where a photograph of Miss Harland had been placed on a table. It was not recent. She appeared younger, less guarded, and someone had chosen it precisely because it suggested approachability. The choice struck Purbright as conscientious. Mrs. Finch stood nearby, guiding a parent toward the book with a gentle hand. When she saw Purbright, she smiled with relief, as if he confirmed that remembrance was being conducted properly. "We felt it important," she said, "to acknowledge her contribution." Purbright nodded. Contribution is easier than absence. Mrs. Finch accepted this as sympathetic agreement and moved away. Purbright watched as names were written carefully, each message similar but distinct enough to avoid accusation of copying. He read none of them closely. Their purpose lay in their accumulation. He was about to leave when a voice behind him said, "Inspector." It was the thin teacher from the staff room, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. His tie had been changed since yesterday, darker now. "I didn't realize there would be this," he said, indicating the table. "Neither did she," Purbright replied mildly. The man frowned. "She wouldn't have wanted fuss." "Few people do," Purbright said. "Fuss tends to benefit the living." They stood together, observing a mother explaining the photograph to her child. The explanation was brief and reassuring. "I keep thinking about yesterday," the man said suddenly. "About how normal it felt." "Yes," said Purbright. "Normal is persuasive." "She asked me a question," the man continued. "Miss Harland, about cover lessons. And I thought it was trivial. I told her it would sort itself out." Purbright turned slightly. "Did it?" The man hesitated. "It usually does." "Usually," Purbright agreed, is a comforting word. Later, in the corridor outside the science wing, Purbright encountered Mrs. Calder again. She was supervising the removal of some student work from a display board. The empty spaces looked oddly exposed. "We're rotating themes," she explained. It didn't seem appropriate to leave it. "No," said Purbright. "It wouldn't." She paused. "People are remembering her in different ways." "They often do," Purbright said. "Memory prefers order, but rarely achieves it." Mrs. Calder considered this. She was difficult sometimes. Yes, but she was right. "About." Mrs. Calder gestured vaguely. "About things that mattered." Purbright did not press. Instead, he asked about the afternoon schedule, about assemblies and routines. Mrs. Calder answered efficiently, grateful for the familiar ground. When he thanked her and turned away, she spoke again. "She wrote things down," she said. "If she thought something was wrong." "Did she think something was wrong?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Calder looked at the display board, now bare. She thought something was about to be. As the day progressed, the school settled into a new version of itself, one that included absence without acknowledging it too directly. Classes ran, bells rang, children adapted with enviable speed. In the staff room, conversation skirted carefully around what could not be said without choosing sides. Purbright returned there briefly, long enough to observe the way people spoke of Miss Harland in the past tense, adjusting adjectives as if unsure which would age best. He left without comment. By late afternoon, the book of condolences was full. Someone closed it gently, as though it might overhear. The photograph remained, smiling with borrowed warmth. Outside, the flowers at the gate had multiplied. Purbright paused there before leaving, reading the small cards attached. They spoke of fairness, dedication, correctness. None mentioned kindness. He stepped back and allowed others to pass. Remembering, he reflected, was an act governed by rules no one admitted to writing. At Langley, those rules were being followed impeccably. Whether they would be sufficient was another matter entirely. Inspector Purbright positioned himself by the school gates shortly before dismissal, when concern tended to gather with the parents rather than the children. He did not stand apart in a manner that invited notice. Instead, he leaned against the low brick wall, observing the choreography of arrival. Prams angled defensively. Conversations paused mid-sentence, glances exchanged with economical meaning. The first bell released a ripple of motion. Parents straightened. Phones were pocketed. Voices lowered. The second bell brought children spilling out, loud with relief, already loosening the day's rules. Names were called, bags were hoisted, Stories began and were swiftly curtailed by adult hands. Purbright waited until the flow thinned. He spoke to a woman with a red scarf who had been watching him with polite interest. "Mrs. Bennet?" he asked. She nodded, surprised. "Yes, I'm Inspector Purbright." Her expression adjusted itself into something cooperative. "Of course." They walked a few steps aside, remaining within sight of the gates. Mrs. Bennet kept her eyes on her son, who was negotiating a dispute over a football. "You taught Miss Harland?" Purbright asked. "She taught my son," Mrs. Bennet corrected gently. "Chemistry. And how was that experience?" Mrs. Bennet smiled. "Structured. In what way?" She expected attention. Preparation. She noticed things. "Did that cause difficulty?" Mrs. Bennet hesitated. "Some parents felt she was exacting." "And you?" "I thought it was good for them." "Good," Purbright said. "For whom?" Mrs. Bennet laughed softly. "For the children." Eventually, another parent approached, a man with a careful manner and a daughter clinging to his coat. He nodded at Mrs. Bennet, then at Purbright. "This is Mr. Harris," Mrs. Bennet said. "We're just speaking with the inspector." Mr. Harris's mouth tightened briefly. "I see." Purbright introduced himself again and asked similar questions. Mr. Harris answered with precision. "She was fair," he said. "Consistent." "Did she ever raise concerns?" Purbright asked. "About homework," Mr. Harris replied. "Deadlines." "And beyond that?" Mr. Harris shook his head. "If she had concerns, she would have gone through the proper channels." "And did she?" Mr. Harris looked toward the school building. "I assume so." As the minutes passed, Purbright spoke with others. Patterns emerged, subtle but persistent. Miss Harland was remembered as correct, demanding, attentive. No one recalled her raising her voice. Several mentioned notes sent home, carefully worded, meticulously timed. One mother spoke of a meeting requested with little explanation. She asked about routines at home. The woman said, "Study habits, sleep," and "I thought it was intrusive." Another father mentioned a disagreement over seating arrangements. "She moved my daughter," he said it would help her focus. "Did it?" "Yes," he admitted. But that wasn't the point. Purbright listened, thanked them, allowed each conversation to end naturally. He noticed how often parents lowered their voices, even outside, even with children out of earshot. Carefulness had become habitual. As the gates closed, he spoke last to Mrs. Bennet again. Her son had joined them, listening with only partial interest. "Did Miss Harland ever seem worried?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Bennet considered. "She once asked me if my son had mentioned anything odd." "Did he?" "No, what did she mean?" "She didn't say." Purbright nodded. "Thank you." As he turned away, Mrs. Bennet added, "She wanted things to be right." "Yes," Purbright said. "Many people do." Walking back toward his car, he reflected on the conversations. Parents, he had learned, were excellent witnesses to atmosphere. They sensed pressure without understanding its source. They noticed changes but explained them away. The school stood quiet now, emptied of its audience. The gates were locked. The wall remained warm from the afternoon sun. Purbright paused before leaving. Parents had spoken carefully, as parents often did, weighing loyalty against honesty. None had lied. None had told the whole truth. That, he thought, was usually where the difficulty began. He returned briefly to the pavement opposite the gates, where a small group lingered, reluctant to be first to leave. Two mothers discussed revision schedules with a seriousness that bordered on strategy. A grandfather waited, smiling at nothing in particular. Purbright listened without intruding. One mother mentioned an email, sent late, asking for confirmation of attendance. Another spoke of a form returned twice for correction. The tone remained measured, but irritation hovered beneath, disciplined into respectability. Purbright asked about meetings. Several had occurred, always brief, always recorded. Notes were taken, copies provided. One parent recalled being thanked for punctuality. Another remembered being reminded of policy. "Did anyone complain?" Purbright asked. A pause followed. Then a woman said, "Complaining wouldn't have helped." "Why not?" She would have been right. As the group dispersed, a boy ran back to retrieve a dropped folder. Purbright handed it to him. The boy thanked him and sprinted away, unburdened. By the time Purbright reached his car, the light had softened. He sat for a moment, engine off, considering the careful language, the shared restraint. Miss Harland had been diligent, perhaps unyielding. She had noticed things and recorded them. Parents had felt judged, and improved themselves accordingly. What none could say, or chose not to, was whether being right had created enemies, or merely obligations that could not be ignored. Purbright started the engine. The school receded in his mirror, orderly and closed, keeping its lessons to itself for one more evening. Tomorrow, he would return, not to ask sharper questions, but to watch how certainty behaved when routine resumed and politeness tightened its careful grip in the ordinary daylight again. Inspector Purbright returned to Langley at the hour when lessons resumed their authority and curiosity was again confined to sanctioned intervals. The school, having absorbed grief into routine, moved with renewed determination. Bells rang decisively. Doors opened and closed with purpose. If memory lingered, it did so quietly, folded into the margins of the day. He was met in reception by a young administrator who spoke briskly and smiled often, as though efficiency were a form of reassurance. She led him to the timetable office, a narrow room lined with color-coded charts that suggested a belief in predictability bordering on faith. A man sat at the desk, sleeves rolled, spectacles balanced low. "Mr. Ellison," Purbright said. "Yes," Ellison replied, already defensive. "I handle scheduling." "I'm interested in recent adjustments," Purbright said. "Minor ones." Ellison relaxed slightly. "There are always minor ones." Purbright took a seat and studied the charts. Classes shifted subtly, teachers reassigned, rooms exchanged. It was all orderly, yet the accumulation of small changes suggested pressure applied over time. Miss Harland queried these, Purbright said. Ellison sighed. She did. Why? She disliked last-minute alterations. Were they last-minute? Ellison hesitated. Some. And unnecessary? Ellison adjusted his spectacles. That depends on perspective. Yours, Purbright said. Ellison smiled thinly. They were efficient. Not necessarily fair. Ellison stiffened. Fairness isn't always practical. Purbright let this settle. Did she raise formal objections? Yes. Notes. Emails. To whom? To me. To Mr. Dalloway. And the response? Ellison spread his hands. Acknowledged, but not acted upon. Ellison's smile returned. Not immediately. Purbright thanked him and left, the charts remaining behind like a promise no one fully believed. In the corridor, he encountered Mr. Dalloway, who greeted him with professional warmth. Everything proceeding, the head teacher asked. As scheduled, Purbright replied. They walked together, Dalloway filling the silence with observations about student morale and parental confidence. Purbright listened, noting the careful optimism, the way temperament was managed through language. She was exacting, Dalloway said eventually. Miss Harland. Yes, but valuable. Until she wasn't. Dalloway stopped walking. Until circumstances changed. Which circumstances? Dalloway smiled. Staffing, resources, realities, and temperament. Dalloway laughed lightly. Temperament is negotiable. Not to everyone, Purbright said. Later, in the staff room, he observed the atmosphere anew. Conversation flowed, but selectively. A joke about double periods drew polite laughter. Someone complained about photocopiers. Miss Harland's name did not appear, though her absence shaped the space she once occupied. Mrs. Finch poured tea with measured care. You've been asking about schedules, she said. Yes. She found them challenging. In what way? She expected consistency and found compromise instead. Mrs. Finch nodded. She wasn't flexible. Was she required to be? Mrs. Finch hesitated. We all are. A bell rang. Teachers stood, gathering belongings. The day resumed its shape. Purbright moved toward the science wing once more, passing classrooms mid-lesson. Voices rose and fell, contained, regulated. In one room, a teacher paused to adjust a seating plan, murmuring reassurance. The students complied without question. In Miss Harland's classroom, a substitute taught from notes left meticulously prepared. The lesson proceeded smoothly. No one mentioned the handwriting. Purbright lingered at the back, observing. The substitute followed the timetable precisely, yet something lacked tension. The students worked, but without vigilance. Order remained, but its edge had softened. After the lesson, the substitute approached him. She left everything very clear, the woman said. Yes, Purbright replied. She believed in preparation. She must have trusted the system, the woman added. Purbright did not correct her. By late afternoon, The timetables were already being revised again. A meeting was scheduled to discuss future allocations. Names were moved, initials erased and rewritten. Temperaments adjusted accordingly. Purbright stood outside the office, listening to voices inside negotiating practicality with civility. No one raised their voice. No one conceded much. He left as the bell marked the end of the day. The sound was sharp, unquestioned. Students poured out, carrying bags and fragments of conversation. The school resumed its outward calm. As he walked away, Purbright considered the interplay of timetables and temperament. One demanded order. The other resisted it. Miss Harland had stood firmly between them, insisting on correctness in a system that preferred accommodation. That, he thought, was rarely forgiven. The assembly was scheduled for 10 o'clock, announced the previous afternoon with deliberate vagueness. Attendance was compulsory. Applause, it was implied without being stated, would not be. Inspector Purbright arrived early and took a seat near the back of the hall, where the wooden benches bore the polish of generations of compliance. The space smelled faintly of varnish and damp coats. Light filtered through high windows, pale and unsentimental, illuminating the stage where a lectern stood alone. A single microphone had been adjusted to a height that suggested compromise. Students filed in under supervision, their chatter subsiding as teachers stationed themselves along the walls. They sat in rows that were straight enough to be respectable, though several children twisted around to look for friends. Murmured corrections followed. Order asserted itself without difficulty. Staff entered last. Mr. Dalloway took his place at the front, flanked by Mrs. Finch and two governors whose expressions suggested appropriate gravity. No one smiled. The atmosphere was not mournful so much as restrained, as if emotion were being rationed. When the hall was full, Mr. Dalloway stepped forward. The microphone produced a brief, protesting hum before settling. "Thank you," he said, pausing until silence completed itself. "We are gathered this morning to acknowledge a loss to our community." He spoke carefully, each phrase balanced to avoid implication. Miss Harland's name was mentioned once, without embellishment. Her contribution was recognized in terms of professionalism and commitment. There was no attempt at warmth. Purbright noticed several teachers nodding in time with the speech, as though marking accuracy. A minute's silence was observed. It was competently done. A chair scraped near the back, quickly stilled. Somewhere, a child coughed and was hushed. The silence ended exactly when expected. "No applause," Mr. Dalloway said gently. "Thank you." The assembly continued with routine notices. Sports fixtures, revision sessions. The ordinary future asserted itself. When it ended, students were dismissed by year group, moving briskly, relieved. Purbright remained seated until the hall emptied. He watched the staff disperse, conversations resuming in low tones. Mrs. Finch paused near the exit, speaking briefly with a governor. Their heads inclined toward one another, sharing something unspoken. Outside, the corridor filled with movement. Lessons resumed. The assembly was already becoming a memory, its purpose fulfilled. Purbright walked slowly, listening. Snatches of conversation floated past him. Handled well. Necessary. Best under the circumstances. No one questioned the format. No one mentioned applause again. In the science wing, he encountered the substitute teacher, gathering papers with visible relief. "That was dignified," she said, as if offering a verdict. "Yes," Purbright replied. "Dignity travels well in groups." She smiled uncertainly and left. Purbright entered the empty classroom. The chairs were stacked now, the desks pushed back to accommodate the assembly timetable. The room felt temporarily displaced, its purpose interrupted. He stood by the window, looking out at the playground where students ran, the moment already spent. Assemblies, he reflected, were exercises in collective agreement. Everyone learned what was acceptable to feel. A voice behind him said, "Inspector." Mrs. Calder stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You attended," she said. "I did." She hesitated. It was appropriate. Yes. She wouldn't have liked attention. Perhaps not. Mrs. Calder moved further into the room. She would have preferred things to continue. And yet they paused, Purbright said. Mrs. Calder folded her arms. Some of us thought the assembly unnecessary. And some thought it insufficient. Purbright nodded. Both positions can coexist politely. Mrs. Calder watched him. You think she would have approved? I think she would have noticed what was omitted, he replied. Mrs. Calder looked away. She noticed omissions. After she left, Purbright remained. The classroom bore signs of adjustment, chairs mismatched, a timetable altered on the board to accommodate the interruption. Small changes tolerated. Later, in the corridor, he encountered a group of students waiting outside a classroom. They spoke quietly, glancing toward the teacher's room. It was weird, one said. We weren't allowed to clap, another replied. You don't clap for teachers? A third said. Why not? No one answered. A teacher appeared and ushered them in. Purbright continued on, the question lingering. By lunchtime, the assembly had been absorbed into the day, its significance diluted by routine. The hall stood empty again, benches aligned, microphones switched off. Before leaving, Purbright returned briefly to the back of the hall. He sat where he had earlier and closed his eyes for a moment. The silence returned easily, as if practiced. An assembly without applause achieved exactly what it intended. It acknowledged loss without inviting response. It reminded everyone of their place. It preserved order. Whether it honored the truth of what had happened was another matter entirely. Inspector Purbright did not return to the school the following morning. Instead, he spent it walking the village, allowing Langley to continue without him while he observed the habits that surrounded it. Schools, he had learned, rarely ended at their gates. They extended into kitchens, pavements, and polite conversations conducted with lowered voices and lifted eyebrows. The bakery opened at 8. By 10 past, 3 parents stood outside, discussing revision timetables as though negotiating treaties. Purbright waited his turn and listened. One mother remarked that children were resilient. Another replied that structure was what they needed. A third said nothing, but nodded in a way that suggested agreement was less important than being seen to participate. Inside, the baker asked after the school. Purbright answered neutrally. The baker shook his head. Terrible thing, he said. But you never really know what goes on behind those doors. No, Purbright agreed. You assume. The word followed him as he crossed the green. Reasonable assumptions, he reflected, were the backbone of community life. They allowed people to function without constant explanation. They also created blind spots that were difficult to acknowledge without embarrassment. At the post office, a notice about the assembly had been pinned beside lost cat posters. Purbright watched as a man read it, frowned, and then shrugged, as if accepting that propriety had been observed and further thought was unnecessary. Late morning found Purbright in his car, parked opposite the school, watching arrivals. Teachers entered singly or in pairs, expressions set before they reached the door. A supply van arrived with laboratory materials. The driver signed in without comment. Life continued efficiently. When Purbright did enter, it was through reception, where the young administrator greeted him with professional brightness. She asked if he needed anything. Just to observe, he said. She smiled, reassured. Observation sounded harmless. He moved through the corridors, noting resumed patterns. Doors opened on schedule. Lessons proceeded. In one classroom, a teacher reminded students to assume nothing not supported by evidence. The irony did not escape him. In the staff room, conversation flowed more freely now. The initial shock had settled into narrative. Miss Harland was spoken of with certainty. She had been difficult. She had been under pressure. She had been unhappy. Each statement was delivered confidently, as though repetition had transformed speculation into fact. Purbright listened without interrupting. Mrs. Finch poured tea and remarked that stress affected everyone differently. A younger teacher suggested that some people simply struggled with change. No one contradicted him. Later, Purbright spoke briefly with Mr. Ellison again, who confirmed that timetables were being stabilized. Things will settle, he said. They always do. Do they? Purbright asked. Ellison smiled. Eventually. In the afternoon, Purbright attended a meeting convened to reassure staff. It was conducted with exemplary calm. Support was offered. Resources were mentioned. The importance of looking forward was emphasized. No one raised a hand. As the meeting ended, Purbright noted the relief with which it dispersed. Uncertainty, when framed as resolved, was gratefully abandoned. He left the building and walked once more along the perimeter fence. Students passed him, discussing homework and weekend plans. One girl mentioned Miss Harland briefly, then changed the subject without prompting. Purbright paused by the science wing windows. Inside, the substitute taught from the prepared notes. The lesson was competent. No questions lingered. Reasonable assumptions, he thought, had already begun to harden. Miss Harlan had been stressed. She had been unhappy. Something unfortunate had happened. The school was not responsible. No one was. That evening, Purbright reviewed his notes. They were sparse by design. He preferred to remember tone rather than detail, the way people spoke when they believed themselves to be correct. Assumptions were rarely malicious. They were efficient. As darkness settled, he considered what had not been assumed. No one had suggested that Miss Harlan might have been right about something important. No one had questioned whether correctness itself could provoke consequence. Purbright closed the notebook. Tomorrow, he would begin to unsettle the assumptions gently, not by contradiction, but by asking questions that required reconsideration. Reasonable assumptions were useful things. They just needed to be tested before they became permanent. Inspector Purbright returned to Langley during the late morning, when the school had regained confidence in its own procedures. The corridors no longer paused for him. Teachers nodded and continued walking. Students adjusted bags and carried on. Conduct had settled into something becoming, as the phrase was often used, behavior appropriate to the setting, agreeable to authority, and unlikely to attract attention. He began in reception, where a notice had been added beneath the assembly announcement. It outlined expectations of student behavior in light of recent events. Respect, calm, normality. The language was careful, aspirational rather than corrective. Purbright watched as a boy read it, then glanced at his friend. They shrugged together and moved on. In the staff room, the mood had shifted again. Conversation now included laughter, subdued but present. Someone mentioned an upcoming inspection. Another complained about parking. Miss Harlan's name surfaced briefly and was dismissed with a nod, as though everyone agreed on its meaning and need not elaborate. Purbright poured himself tea without being offered. No one objected. "You've been quiet," Mrs. Finch said, not accusingly. "I'm listening," Purbright replied. She smiled. "You'll find we're very transparent." "Yes," he said, "about some things." She accepted this without offense. "We're professionals. We manage ourselves." "Is that difficult?" Purbright asked. "Only when people refuse to be managed." He let that rest. Nearby, two teachers discussed seating plans. One mentioned that Miss Harlan's arrangements had been revised. "Too rigid," she said. "The children need flexibility." "And boundaries," the other replied. "Boundaries can be adjusted." Purbright left them to it and walked toward the science wing. Outside the classroom, a group of students waited, talking quietly. When the door opened, they straightened, expressions settling into attentive neutrality. Conduct asserted itself automatically. Inside, the substitute teacher proceeded with a practical demonstration. Safety rules were recited, complied with, largely unexamined. Purbright noted how readily the class followed instruction when expectation was clear. Afterwards, he spoke briefly with the teacher. "They behave well," she said. "They always did," Purbright replied. She hesitated. Miss Harlan was particular. Yes. But effective. Yes. And not very forgiving. Purbright tilted his head. Of what? Of excuses. Later, he met Mr. Dalloway in the corridor. The head teacher looked relieved to see him, as though reassured by continuity. "We're settling," Dalloway said. "That's important." "Settling," Purbright echoed. "Children need stability. Staff too. And stability requires consistency and compliance." Dalloway laughed softly. "I'd say cooperation." Purbright smiled politely. "Of course." They walked together past classrooms where lessons proceeded undisturbed. In one room, a teacher corrected a student's tone before addressing content. In another, a child was reminded to sit properly before asking a question. Conduct, Purbright reflected, was taught continuously, often invisibly. He spent the afternoon observing meetings. Brief discussions about curriculum adjustments. A conversation regarding extracurricular supervision. All conducted with measured language and mutual reassurance. No disagreements surfaced, though several were implied. At one point, Mrs. Calder remarked that standards must be maintained. Heads nodded. No one asked whose standards. As the day drew toward its close, Purbright stood again near the gates. Parents arrived, conversations resuming with familiar care. A mother reminded her daughter to mind her manners. A father cautioned his son about tone. Purbright spoke with a woman he had not met before. She mentioned that her child had found Miss Harland intimidating. "Did that trouble you?" he asked. "At first," she said, "but my daughter improved." "In what way?" "She became more careful." "Careful can mean many things," Purbright said. "Yes," the woman agreed. "That's what worried me." The bell rang. Children poured out, restraint dissolving into noise. Conduct loosened, temporarily forgiven. Teachers watched, intervening only when necessary. As the crowd thinned, Purbright remained. Conduct, he thought, was not merely behavior. It was expectation enforced through repetition, rewarded with acceptance. Miss Harland had enforced it without softness, without allowance. She had insisted that rules meant what they said. That kind of insistence unsettled systems built on negotiation. Before leaving, Purbright glanced back at the building. Lights glowed in several windows where staff worked late. Paperwork, preparation, correction, conduct becoming, he reflected, was praised when it blended in. When it challenged convenience, it became something else entirely. He turned away, certain now that whatever had happened to Miss Harland had not arisen from chaos, but from order applied too precisely, in a place that preferred its discipline moderated by discretion. Tomorrow, he would ask questions that tested not behavior, but the comfort people took in calling it reasonable. Inspector Purbright noticed first the tone in which people spoke to him. It had shifted again, becoming lighter, almost companionable, as though enough time had passed to allow familiarity without impropriety. Politeness, he knew, was never static. It adapted, absorbing unease and releasing it in more acceptable forms. He arrived just after lunch, when the school's rhythm softened briefly. Doors were open, voices carried. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and overcooked vegetables. In reception, the administrator smiled and asked if he'd like tea. She did not ask why he was there. He declined and walked on, letting his presence settle without announcement. In the corridor, two teachers paused mid-conversation and resumed with exaggerated normality. One spoke about coursework deadlines. The other agreed too readily. Purbright stopped by a display of student essays. The topic was responsibility. Several titles included the word respect underlined. He read a few opening lines. They were earnest, cautious, and carefully balanced. Behind him, footsteps approached. Mr. Ellison joined him, hands clasped. "Impressive," Ellison said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "They've learned how to say the right things." Ellison laughed. "That's education." "Is it?" Purbright asked. Ellison shifted. "We encourage expression, within bounds." Ellison nodded. Naturally, they walked together toward the staff room. Inside, conversation dipped and recovered. Someone made space for Purbright without comment. Mrs. Finch asked after his day, genuinely curious. "I'm learning," he said. She smiled. "We all are." He asked about recent meetings, about emails exchanged late at night, about concerns raised and resolved. Answers came smoothly. Everything had been addressed. Procedures followed. Language softened. Mrs. Finch spoke of support. Mrs. Calder mentioned understanding. Mr. Dalloway's name surfaced repeatedly, always in conjunction with reassurance. And Miss Harland? Purbright asked. A pause. Brief. Polite. She struggled, Mrs. Finch said. With change. And with tone, someone added. What tone? Purbright asked. Direct, Mrs. Finch replied. Some found it abrupt. Truth can sound abrupt, Purbright said mildly. No one disagreed. No one agreed either. Later, in the corridor, he encountered a student lingering outside a classroom. The boy straightened when he saw Purbright. Everything all right? Purbright asked. Yes, sir, the boy said quickly. Waiting for someone? The boy nodded. The teacher said to. And how did she say it? The boy considered. Politely. Purbright smiled. That's good. Yes, sir. The teacher arrived and thanked the boy for waiting. Her tone was pleasant, her smile practiced. The boy followed her inside without looking back. Purbright continued on. In a small office near the science wing, he found a stack of printed emails awaiting filing. He did not read them, only noted their careful formatting, the consistent greetings and closings. Politeness left traces, he reflected. It smoothed rough edges, but it also recorded pressure, encoded in phrasing and timing. He spoke briefly with the caretaker, who mentioned that Miss Harland had often stayed late. She was always courteous, the man said. Said thank you. Asked properly. Did that matter? Purbright asked. The caretaker shrugged. It stood out. In the late afternoon, Purbright sat in an empty classroom, listening to the building settle. Outside, rain began lightly, tapping the windows with tentative insistence. The room smelled of chalk and damp wool. He considered the conversations he had heard. No one had been unkind. No one had raised their voice. Disagreements had been expressed as concern, objections as suggestions. Everything had been conducted correctly. And yet, politeness, he knew, could conceal refusal as effectively as hostility. It could deny without appearing to. It could isolate while maintaining civility. As he stood to leave, Mrs. Calder appeared in the doorway. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." She hesitated. "People are saying you're thorough." "They're being polite," Purbright replied. She smiled faintly. Miss Harland would have appreciated that. Would she? Mrs. Calder looked away. She preferred clarity. And did she receive it? Mrs. Calder did not answer immediately. Not always. Outside, the rain had strengthened. Parents waited by the gates under umbrellas, speaking softly. Children emerged, noise subdued by weather and watchfulness. Purbright stood back, observing. A mother reminded her daughter to say please. A father thanked a teacher for her patience. Politeness flowed easily, oiling every exchange. As the gates closed and the crowd dispersed, Purbright remained. What politeness concealed here was not cruelty, but avoidance. Decisions softened until they no longer felt like decisions at all. Responsibility diffused into process. Miss Harland, he thought, had refused to soften. She had asked questions plainly and expected answers equally so. In a place governed by courteous deflection, that refusal would have been conspicuous. He turned away as the rain eased. Tomorrow, he would begin to speak less politely himself, not rudely, but plainly enough to disturb the careful surface. Sometimes, he reflected, politeness was not the opposite of violence. It was simply quieter and far more difficult to challenge. Inspector Purbright arrived early, before the school had fully agreed on what the previous days meant. The gates were unlocked but unattended, swinging slightly in a breeze that carried the smell of wet leaves and chalk dust. Inside, lights were already on in the offices, where decisions were made quietly and recorded carefully, their consequences distributed over time. He was shown into a small meeting room beside reception. The furniture had been arranged with tact, chairs equidistant, a jug of water placed centrally, biscuits untouched. Mr. Dalloway arrived first, followed by Mrs. Finch and Mr. Ellison. Mrs. Calder joined last, closing the door with deliberate softness. No one spoke until everyone was seated. "Thank you for coming," Dalloway said. "We appreciate discretion." "I expect it," Purbright replied. The discussion began without ceremony. Timetables were mentioned, then staffing pressures, then the difficulty of maintaining standards during periods of change. Each speaker contributed in turn, never overlapping, never raising a voice. Purbright listened, hands folded, allowing the rhythm to establish itself. Miss Harland's name entered the conversation gradually, introduced as context rather than subject. She had been conscientious. She had been firm. She had, it was agreed, struggled with adaptation. The phrasing remained careful, each adjective balanced by another. Purbright asked a single question. What did she record? There was a pause, brief but unanimous. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat. Concerns, minor discrepancies, regarding, scheduling, room usage, supervision gaps, and these were addressed? In due course, Dalloway said. Purbright nodded. Not before she died. The room adjusted to the statement. Mrs. Finch reached for the water jug and did not pour. Mrs. Calder folded her hands more tightly. It would be inappropriate, Dalloway said, to draw conclusions. Of course, Purbright replied. I'm interested in arrangements. Ellison frowned. Arrangements? Quiet ones, Purbright said. The sort made to prevent inconvenience. Silence followed, longer this time. When Mrs. Finch spoke, her voice was composed. We managed the situation. How? Purbright asked. By ensuring continuity. And Miss Harland? Mrs. Finch hesitated. She was isolated. Purbright inclined his head. Politely. No one contradicted him. The meeting continued, its purpose slowly clarifying. There had been no single conflict, no dramatic argument. Instead, there had been a sequence of decisions, each reasonable on its own. Notes unanswered, requests deferred, responsibilities redistributed without announcement. Miss Harland had been left to comply or persist. She persisted, Purbright said. Yes, Dalloway replied. She did. And on the day she died, Dalloway looked at the table. She had requested clarification. Again, which was not given. It was scheduled, Ellison said quickly. For later, Purbright said. No one disputed this. Purbright stood. You believed, he said, that the system would absorb her. Mrs. Calder spoke quietly. It always does. Purbright looked at her. Sometimes it fails. He thanked them and left before further agreement could form. Outside, the school was waking fully now. Students arrived, voices rising, bags dropped, lives continuing. The arrangement remained intact. Purbright paused at the gates and looked back. No one followed him. No one needed to. The matter had been settled without confrontation, without accusation. Responsibility had been shared so evenly it no longer resembled responsibility at all. He crossed the playground slowly, noting the chalk markings still faintly visible despite the rain. Games were resumed in their outlines, rules remembered even when players changed. A caretaker nodded to him and continued sweeping, moving debris from one boundary to another with practiced indifference. Order was maintained by repetition. In the corridor, a teacher intercepted him, apologizing for the interruption. She asked whether everything would be all right. The question was framed generously, as though reassurance were an administrative duty. Purbright answered that things would proceed as arranged. She thanked him and returned to her class, comforted by the word arranged, which suggested intention without demanding explanation. He stopped once more outside the science room. The door was closed, the window blind half drawn against glare. Inside, a lesson was underway, voices measured, instructions followed. He did not enter. Observation, he knew, could be as disruptive as inquiry. By mid-morning, the school had settled into the pattern it preferred: purposeful movement, moderated conversation, a confidence that came from believing outcomes were manageable. The earlier meeting would be discussed later in fragments, never as a whole. Each participant would recall it slightly differently, but agree on its necessity. Purbright returned to his car and sat for a moment without starting the engine. He considered Miss Harland not as a victim, but as a presence gradually reduced. She had been correct when correctness was inconvenient. She had asked plainly when answers required negotiation. The arrangement had responded by becoming quieter around her, until quiet became exclusion. The village absorbed this as it absorbed most things. People would speak of tragedy and move on. The school would refine its processes. No one would be blamed in a way that mattered. That was the arrangement's strength. He wrote his notes, choosing words that would pass easily through review. He did not accuse. He described. He allowed behavior to speak for itself. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it beside him. The end.